The Graves case looks at an effort by the prosecution in this Kentucky case to use a prior drug sale to show that the defendant was engaged in a subsequent drug sale. And this is really a classic misuse of prior bad act evidence, as the Kentucky Supreme Court clearly demonstrates or states in its opinion. The prosecution had set up a sting operation, or the law enforcement authorities in Kentucky had set up a sting operation, and the defendant twice came to this residence of a confidential informant and purchased drugs. And the reason that we're even resorting to this type of evidence, there were two very odd quirks in this case. The first of which is, for some reason, the Commonwealth of Kentucky chose to prosecute only one of the two drug transactions. And so we're using the other to bolster the case in the first example. The second odd quirk of this is that the law enforcement officials lost the recording of the drug transaction. So they're looking for any way they can to bolster the case against the defendant. The only thing they now have is the eyewitness identification of the undercover informant who did the drug transaction. And that particular person is going to have credibility issues because he, like most confidential informants, is doing this for some gain. Usually the confidential informant's doing this to get out of criminal prosecution himself. So we now are trying to bolster the Commonwealth's case that this was the defendant in the second drug transaction by looking at the fact that there was a prior drug transaction that was very, very similar, says the prosecution. They say it's the same location. It's the same buyer. It's the same set of drugs. It's the same officers watching the thing. Well, with modus operandi, remember from our last video, what we're looking for is some trademark, something that suggests if the defendant did it on the one occasion, he did it on the other occasion. Here, someone came to the confidential informant's house on two occasions and bought drugs. And of course, the same officers were watching, and of course, they're the same drugs. You can offer a litany of the same of things, like there was the same paint color on the walls in the room because it's the same room. At a certain point, you're just identifying similarities that have no real trademark-like quality, and that's what they're doing here. But more importantly and more fundamentally, as the Kentucky Supreme Court points out in this case, and this case is a great one to illustrate exactly what we mean when we talk about using a prior known quantity of a trademark to then show that it's the same defendant when the same trademark offense occurs the second time. The known quantity in the first trademark example is that we know who the defendant is. So, a man walks into a bank dressed as the San Diego Chicken and robs the bank. We learn that that's Bob Scott. We then move to the second example where we have someone else on videotape robbing a bank dressed as the San Diego Chicken. We don't know who that is, but we know the last time it was done, it was Bob Scott. So the jury can at least infer with such a unique trademark example that it's the same person in each case. And if we know who one of them is, there's at least some evidence we know who both of them is. So if we go back now to Commonwealth versus Graves, we have a very common drug transaction. On two occasions, someone shows up at the defendant's house to buy drugs, the same type of drugs. That's the beginning and the end of the similarities, and whatever similarities there are, as the Kentucky Supreme Court points out, those were created by the folks who created this transaction, namely the police through their confidential informant. So the similarities are kind of irrelevant here, and then we don't have any way of knowing, independent of the confidential informant's testimony, that one of these transactions involves the defendant. The eyewitness identifies in both cases it was the defendant, but our effort to use the first transaction to bolster the second, or to use the first transaction to bolster our belief that it was the defendant in the second one, depends on the fact that we've got a better set of facts connecting the defendant to the first than the second one. And we don't have that. There's nothing that supports, there's no better proof in drug transaction 1 that this is the defendant than there is in drug transaction 2. And so this case really shows that really does a good job of illustrating what we're talking about with modus operandi proof. You need a control group, for those of you with a science background. You need a case in which you know that trademark example involves the defendant. So when we get the trademark example for a second time, that we can say, just like in the other example that we know it, where we know it was the defendant, we also have reason to believe it was the defendant again. And then secondly, and perhaps as importantly as an illustrative point, it's got to be something that's unique. And here there was absolutely nothing unique about a drug transaction at the residence of the confidential informant.